Floating home lending rates have changed. The number of houses for sale has made a move. A lender made a big change that will have a huge impact on the floating home market. What's it mean for buyers and sellers? Stick around and find out. There are three main updates about Portland's floating homes that you really need to know about. One of them has to do with the lender's rate increase. The other has to do with sales volume. And that's not a big deal, but it's important to be aware of as a seller, also as a buyer. And the third has to do with the number of floating homes for sale. Number of floating homes for sale, I'll start with that first. At this time of year, that is around May 1st, the number of floating homes for sale was 61. That's in and around Portland, Oregon. In comparison with previous years, the previous 7 years, in fact, that is 68% higher than what we usually see around this time of year. It's not that the market is flooded with floating homes. I don't expect that prices are going to drop because of the volume, because sales volume actually is up a little bit. It's up. So that's the second point I wanted you to be aware of, is sales volume so far this year, that is January through April, is up about 22% in comparison with the average of the past 7 years ending last year, 2023. But having the number of floating homes that is up for sale on the market to be 61 as of May 1st is pretty high. That's a number that we would tend to see here and there, not too awfully frequently, during the past 6 or 7 years in the middle of summer, not as of the 1st of May. And I know of a few more floating homes coming onto the market over the next few weeks, so that number is going to continue to increase. Consider also that the number of houses that are in pending status, that is, the sellers have accepted offers, but the sales haven't closed yet, we have only a few of those, only about 3. So we're really seeing not a great slowdown in the sales volume. Again, sales volume for the first 4 months of the year is up 22% in comparison with the 7-year average. But the number for sale is pretty high, 68% higher, in fact. The other thing that you should be aware of, and this is a pretty big one, is that out of the 3 floating home lenders, one of them changed their rates, and they changed them pretty dramatically. It went up from, that lender increased their rates from 7% up to 9%. That's for a loan where you pay as if you're paying on a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, is commonly the case for normal houses on land. But you have to pay it off within 7 years. That's after reducing their rates around the 1st of April, roughly, by about 0.5% to get down to 7 from 7.5. They increased them to 9%. That's not all. The rate increase is pretty dramatic. There's still a lender that'll lend below that level, below 8% for people who are well qualified and have a high credit score. But the other big thing with that lender is they used to be the lender to go to for 3 different things. One is if somebody wanted to borrow money to buy a floating home as an investment property, something that they would rent out part of the time. That's a lender that would consider lending to a borrower to buy a floating home to do that. They also would lend to people who would buy a second home, a floating home as a second home, that is. So say if you live in Bend, or you live in Lake Oswego or Boise or Phoenix or wherever you're coming into town from, not that Lake Oswego is that awfully far away, to enjoy the weekend or a couple of weeks in a floating house here and there that you chose to buy, not just rent, because basically renting that short term is nearly impossible. That would be the lender that you would go to. They no longer are lending to buy investment properties or second homes, and they also, and this is the biggest deal, they also are not lending to buy floating homes unless the float rating is at least a 4. Now, call me if you have any questions about what a float rating is and you want to talk through what is for sale that has a good float, what it means to have a good float, how high of a score a float has to be, what's the highest on the scale, any of those things. Call me anytime. I'd be happy to talk through that with you. But what they've decided is the float score has to be a 4. They used to be the lender who would be able to incorporate float work into the price of the home, into the sales price, hold money back from the seller at closing to pay the float builder after closing. So after the buyer buys the house, closes on it, it's their house, money would be kept at a title company. The title company would release funds to the float builder over time as the float work got done after closing. And it could take as long as a year to get the float work done by the time you get on the person's schedule and they can actually do the work, which sometimes would take as long as a couple of months, depending on how extensive the float work is. This lender will no longer lend to buy a floating home unless the float rates at least a 4, which is in really good shape. And they won't lend if any maintenance work, if any float repairs at all are called for in an inspection report, a float inspection report. So that's a pretty big change for buyers and for sellers. Sellers who have a floating home that has a float rating of say a 3 or a 3+, that's going to reduce the number of lenders down to 1, possibly 2, who would lend to buy a floating home, depending on what in the end the float score is. There is a third lender who from time to time on a case-by-case basis will lend still to buy a floating home. Call me anytime if you are thinking about buying a floating house. Call me if you are curious to know which floating homes for sale have a float under them that is in good shape. I tend to know what the float score is, and in some cases anyway, I have an educated guesstimate as to whether or not a float would be in good shape based on its age. Or if I happen to know what the score used to be, say 2 or 3 or 5 years ago, that helps shed some light on whether the float is good enough to qualify for financing. Call me anytime. Also, just talk about Portland's real estate market, Portland's floating homes, or anything else for that matter. The Seattle Seahawks, whatever's on your mind, give me a call.